All right, welcome to our last lesson for Unit 1. This is covering topics 1.9 to 1.11, and it's going to be on ecosystem interactions and then energy flow within ecosystems. So the learning goal is that you will be able to describe the different roles that organisms play in an ecosystem as well as how energy flows through an ecosystem. So let's review a couple of things first. Believe these are things that we talked about way back in lesson 2. And that is levels of organization within an ecosystem. So we start super basic, an organism. This is a single individual of a single species because one individual is only one species. Then we have a population. That's going to be every single individual of a single species in an area. So it could be in whatever ecosystem you are defining, and that would be whatever is being defined. So it could be the state of Oklahoma, it could be the city of Tulsa, it could be this specific forest, it could be this half of the US, whatever it is, whatever that defined space is, a population is going to be all of the individuals of one specific species. If we look at every single biotic thing in that defined area, so every single living thing, it's going to be all of those populations combined. That's our biological community. So the community of all of the living things in that defined area. Then we get to an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is the living things with the non-living things, those interactions. So at this stage right here, it's all the living things. To get up to this stage of ecosystem, we're adding in all of the abiotic factors that impact that biological community in their life and in their ecosystem. And then all similar ecosystems are biomes. And then the biosphere is everywhere on Earth that there are living things. So a little bit into the crust of the earth because we have all the earthworms, bacteria, microbes, all of that down there, and then a little bit into the atmosphere wherever birds and flying things can fly. All right, so this is just a bigger breakdown of those levels of organizations, but starting with ecosystem. So again, ecosystem is all the biotic and abiotic things. These are all the abiotic, or examples of all the abiotic things that we could see. So we have energy, climate, weather, minerals, water, air, pH, salinity, temperature, soil, sunlight, atoms, molecules. All of those are abiotic things. They're not living, they're not reproducing, they're not breathing, nothing like that. And then we have the biotic. So a community is all of the different species. So we have species 1, species 2, species 3, species 4. All of those make up the community. Each one of these is a population, so all of these trees, all of these mushrooms, that is a population. And then we can break it down into the individual organism. Okay, so for these interactions, we need to know what a community is. So again, a community is an assemblage of all of the interacting species of organisms in an area. It's all of the living things. And if they're living in an area together, then in some way they are theoretically interacting, even if it's through competition or whatever. And then an ecosystem is a defined space in which interactions take place between a community with all of its complex interrelationships and the physical environment. So interactions between living things, non-living things, and then all of those relationships that come from that. Within ecosystems, there's something called a keystone species. So a keystone species plays a critical role in the maintenance of specific ecosystems. So it's named after this stone right here. So this arch is made up of stones. This stone right here is known as the keystone. It is the key to this arch being like structurally sound. If we removed that keystone from this arch, the rest of the arch would come crumbling down. And that's the same idea behind a keystone species. Without a keystone species, the ecosystem changes dramatically. So one example of a keystone species is a bison. So when bison are present in American tallgrass prairie ecosystems, they increase the biodiversity of the site. They help make that ecosystem more healthy, more diverse, and better functioning. They are a keystone species. They're not the only example of keystone species. There are others, but they are just one example. I want to comment as well. Keystone species are not always the top predators. So like bison eat grass. They're not the top predator really in a tall grass prairie. Sometimes it can be a top predator, but sometimes it's not. It's not always going to be what's at the top of the food chain that's, regulating everything. All right, so major roles in ecosystems. So ecologists have divided organisms' roles the ecosystems into three broad categories. The first one are going to be the producers. So producers are organisms that are able to use reuse sources of energy to make complex organic molecules from simple inorganic substances in their environment. Basically, they are able to photosynthesize. There is another way that they can, like deep in the ocean, there are some organisms that are able to do something that's very similar to photosynthesis, but instead of getting light energy, they're using like heat and chemical energy. However, in most ecosystems that we are going to look at, we have producers are photosynthesizing. They are producing energy within the environment. They're bringing that sunlight energy in. Consumers are organisms that require organic matter as a source of food. They are eating other things. So raccoons can't just lay in the sun and photosynthesize. They have to eat other things to get their energy. And then last but not least, we have decomposers. So mushrooms, molds, fungi, things like that are organisms that use non-living organic matter, things that have died, as a source of energy and raw materials to build their bodies. And in the process of them, basically eating those dead things, they help to break down or decompose those dead things and give nutrients back into the soil. Consumers can then be further divided into categories based on the things that they eat and the way that they obtain food. So if we're just looking at these guys right here. So consumers are organisms that require organic matter as a source of food. Organisms that are eating other things. There are three different categories. We have primary consumers or herbivores that eat plants as a source of food. Secondary consumers or carnivores or animals that eat other animals. And then we have omnivores. So omnivores consume both plants and animals. So we could say primary consumer or herbivore. We can say secondary consumer or carnivore. And then omnivores are like kind of in the middle. They are eating other animals, but they are also eating plants. Many species are omnivores. We'll explain how that energy flow works, but it just makes evolutionary more sense for animals to be able to eat a diverse range of things, which means being an omnivore is usually beneficial. All right, so popping back over to decomposers. So decomposers, again, are organisms that use non-living organic matter as a source of energy and raw materials to build their bodies. Since decomposers carry on respiration, which is, breaking down energy in cells, releasing CO2, they are extremely important in the recycling matter by converting organic matter into inorganic matter. We went over our biogeochemical cycles where we looked at how different nutrients or elements or things are cycled through ecosystems. Decomposers play a role in almost every single one of those. So they are taking the organic materials that make up our bodies because we have eaten food and created bodies, and they break that back down, give it back to the soil so that that cycle can start again. All right, so these are examples of different roles in ecosystems. I think some of these we have mentioned before, maybe in other lessons, but are different categories, the major role or action, and then different examples. You can pause on this screen if you'd like to take a gander for a little while, but we should be familiar with all of these. Okay, let's look at energy flow through ecosystems. So each step in the flow of energy through an ecosystem is known as a trophic level. And as energy moves from one trophic level to the next, most of the useful energy, 90% of it, is lost as heat. This is because of the second law of thermodynamics, where when energy changes form, some of it has to be lost as unusable energy, which typically is going to be heat. So because it's difficult to measure the amount of energy that's contained in each trophic level, we use biomass instead. So biomass is the weight of living material. If we know how much living material there is, all living material requires energy to survive, and so we can kind of equate those the same. So this is what we mean by trophic level. So I'm going to show you two graphics that kind of depict this a little bit differently. But we have this big green block right here. These are our producers. So bacteria, algae, plants, things that are photosynthesizing. So they are taking in solar energy, sunlight, and producing sugar in a form that other creatures and themselves can use. They are the first trophic level. And then we go up to herbivores. 90% of the energy from bacteria, algae, plants, from the producers is lost as heat. Only 10% make it to the herbivores. That means that if there is, 100 whatever of plants, there can only be then 10 of the same measurement of herbivores, because 90% of the energy that they would need is lost as heat. Only 10% moves on, which is why this block is so much bigger than this one, because there has to be way more plants to then support this, because only 10% of the energy from this level is going to make it to the herbivores. It's the same exact thing going up to primary carnivores. 90% of then what was able to make it to herbivores is lost as heat, and only 10% is then passed on to primary carnivores, and then even more to secondary carnivores. That's why if you look at an ecosystem, most of the living organisms in an ecosystem are going to be plants, because they need that many plants to take in and produce that energy and those sugars to then support every animal that's at a higher trophic level than them, because only 10% makes it up every single step. So this is another way. This is the way I prefer a little bit more, because I think it just makes a little bit more sense. But producers down here at the bottom, they are what is holding up all of the other energy levels. So for producers, decomposers get energy from all of these because they decompose anything that dies. But 90% of that energy is lost as heat. 10% makes it to herbivores. So the herbivore population can only be 10% as big as the producing population. Carnivores can only be 10% as big as the herbivore population. And then if we're going from secondary consumer up to tertiary, that means like the tippity top, that can only be 10% as big as this carnivore level, which is why it makes sense for animals to be able to evolutionarily eat at different levels, because if you are only able to eat animals, then you're missing out on all of this possible energy, or 10% of that possible energy. Okay, so when we are looking at trophic levels, a lot of the times we just want to depict the relationship between animals. So what's eating what animal, where is the energy flowing? We use food chains and food webs for that. So a food chain is a series of organisms that are occupying different trophic levels through which energy passes as a result of one organism consuming another. So like these leaves are eaten by this grasshopper, which is then eaten by this mouse, which is then eaten by this snake, which is then eaten by this bird. It is showing exactly where the energy is flowing. When we are drawing these arrows, it's showing the energy flow. So when this grasshopper is eating these leaves, the leaves are not getting the energy. So we're not going to have an arrow from grasshopper to leaves. The grasshopper is getting the energy from the leaves, so that's the way that the arrow is going to go. A food web is a series of multiple overlapping food chains, because realistically, this grasshopper is not only eating these leaves. This mouse is not only eating these grasshoppers. It's going to look a little bit more like this, where these leaves are eaten by insects and by the deer and by the rabbits and by the mice. These mice are also eating fungi and bacteria. They're also eating invertebrates. And then this chipmunk is eating nuts and eating bugs, and then it's getting eaten by foxes, and it's getting eaten by hawks and owls and snakes. Everything is connected in some way. Another reason that we like these food webs is we can see every interaction. So one thing that you may be asked to explain is, what could possibly happen to this deer if there was way more rabbits? If there's a huge increase in rabbits, what could happen to the deer? Well, they don't interact directly, but they both eat leaves. If there's way more rabbits, maybe like the fox population goes down, and so the rabbit population booms because they're not getting eaten by foxes. They're going to eat way more leaves because there's a higher population and they all need to eat. If they're eating way more leaves, that means that there's less leaves for the deer, so the deer population might go down. So with this crazy web of all of these interactions, we can see, okay, if there was a epidemic that hit the foxes and the fox population crashed because they all died of a disease, the rabbit population would boom. That means they'd eat a bunch of leaves, which means the deer couldn't eat as many leaves. So we can look at those interactions and kind of predict what the impact would be. All right, that is the end of this unfortunately long lesson. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next one.